Hi, welcome to the virtual Westdale Theater. I'm Fred Fuchs, the chair of the board for this wonderful organization. And tonight we'd like to introduce you to what we plan to do at the theater now that we're closed, and bring to you a series of online film clubs where hopefully you'll be exposed to some wonderful films and have a chance to interact and discuss them with different moderators over the next few months. I hope there was no confusion. We're not going to be actually showing American Graffiti tonight or showing any films during the book club. We do not have the rights to do that. What we're going to do is curate and recommend films that hopefully you will see during the week. And then when the time comes for the book club session, you'll be able to discuss them, get feedback, learn some interesting information, and hopefully that'll be very enjoyable. This is the first time we've done this. I hope you're all hearing me and seeing me okay. I'm starting to get used to this new technology as long as many other people, and I think it's really wonderful we're able to obviously do this. Now, for those who don't know, the Westdale Theater is located in Hamilton, Ontario. About 3 years ago, a group of volunteers, civic-minded leaders got together. We managed to raise the money to purchase a beautiful old Art Deco theater and have restored it. We've been open for about a year now. And then we, have been doing really well and presenting films. We also have a stage and music and all this kind of wonderful opportunity. It's sort of become a community hub. So this is an opportunity, of course, where I'm going to talk about one of my favorite films, American Graffiti. But at the end, please stay on, because we're going to explain how we're going to try to organize these book clubs, which will not be Facebook Live, and they'll be interactive, where perhaps 12 members or so in each club, and you'll be able to have online discussions and really go in depth. So that's really the plan. But we thought we'd kick it off with this conversation about American Graffiti. My background is being a movie producer. I was very fortunate. I lived in Los Angeles, and then I also lived in San Francisco for 12 years. And I worked as a producer for Francis Ford Coppola, produced 12 of his movies, 6 of his movies. But the first was a film that was actually financed and executive produced by George Lucas. It was called Tucker, A Man and His Dream. And it was the first film that was done up at Skywalker Ranch. And I also lived in San Rafael, which was the same town that George lived in. So although I did get to work with him and get to know him a bit, much of the information about American Graffiti was not from my own personal experience. I was still in college. But there are many wonderful stories about this film, the miracle it was, how it happened, how it came together, the impact it had on this industry. And in fact, many of these stories, though, I'm going to be telling you about actually came from a wonderful book about George Lucas called George Lucas, A Life. And it was written by Brian J. Jones. And if you're interested in a lot more information about George and his life, I would highly recommend this book. And that is the source of a lot of the things I'll be talking about. American Graffiti is often referred to as George's most personal film. And of course, it was inspired by his own life and experiences growing up in Modesto, California. It's a small town in the Central Valley of California, just south of Sacramento. And the film is set in 1962 when Lucas was in high school. And many of the characters represent different stages of Lucas's younger life. Kurt Henderson, of course, is sort of more modeled after his personality when he went to film school at USC. John Milner is based on his teenage street racing and junior college years and hot rod enthusiastics. And then, of course, there's Terry the Toad Fields, who represented Lucas's nerdy years as a freshman in high school and his bad luck with dating. Steve was not part of George's personality or life, but he knew a lot of Steves who were always on top and successful without even trying. So Lucas was born in 1944, and Modesto was a classic Americana town. His father owned a successful stationery store, was a Methodist, and he assumed his son would follow in his footsteps. George was always told to apply yourself, and with that strong work ethic, things would happen. Lucas was part of that first generation who grew up in front of a TV set, with the great serials, the westerns, Flash Gordon, and popular culture exploding all around. Lucas was there at the opening day of Disneyland in 1955. And then, of course, the birth of rock and roll in the late 50s, and Elvis Presley on Ed Sullivan. Music was a huge part of his life. And as reflected in the film, he really did have this great passion for cars. When he was 15, he got a Fiat Piancina and managed to get it all souped up and used to race cars. There was a car club called the Pharaohs, and George was sort of the mascot. He was a very small and kind of scrawny kid during this time, and he was addicted to cruising, which was a sort of distinctive American mating ritual, all done in cars on those grid streets of Modesto. And what was particularly interesting to me was learning, of course, that in June of 1962, when George was about to graduate from high school, or possibly not graduate because his grades were so bad, he was in a horrible car crash. And in fact, people seeing the car thought he would die, but he did survive. The teachers all thought, that this could be the end, though, and they decided to give him passing grades. So he did manage to get out of high school. And I think this crash was pretty profound. He decided to give up on the cars, decided to do something with his life, wound up going to Modesto Junior College for 2 years, and then going to USC to study cinema. And some common themes that you'll see in this movie and his other movies include the idea of the victorious underdog, the theme of coming from nothing and succeeding, the idea of living for tomorrow. You can do anything, you must apply yourself, but your past does not define you. And then, of course, as Wolfman Jack says to Kurt in the seminal scene of American Graffiti, get your ass in gear. So, in 1962, this is a film about growing up, not just about leaving high school. This was the year before the Kennedy assassination, a time when the world had changed, innocence ended, everyone had to grow up. The government changed, drugs came in, the Vietnam War got worse, even music started to change. And it wasn't something you could fight, you just had to evolve. And few films, as many of the critics recognized, have shown quite so well the eagerness, the sadness, the ambitions, and the small defeats of a generation of young Americans. So George was a very successful student at USC. In fact, he won a film prize for THX 118, a short film that he had originally made as a student. And part of winning that award was an internship at Warner Brothers, where he met Francis Coppola, who was directing Finian's Rainbow. Ultimately, with Francis's help, they turned THX 118 into a feature film for Warner Brothers. But as much as the film was admired critically and was successful at Cannes and had many good reviews, it was a bit of a bomb at the box office. It seemed to be lacking in character and heart and accessibility. And by the time that was over, George was 26 years old and broke and not really clear what the next film he wanted to do was. The film he was hoping to do, of course, was a film he had developed with John Milius called Apocalypse Now, a friend from USC. John Milius was a great writer, and this was something, that had been a passion to try to tell this story for George. But Francis and many others said you had to write something lighthearted, something more accessible, something more commercial, to give you a chance to get back in the good graces of the studios and have your career start to evolve. So he wrote from his heart about his high school years, living in Modesto and about a very specific time and place. And writing was very hard for George. He never loved the writing process. It was hard work. He had brilliant ideas, often worked with collaborators. And this script was written also with some USC friends, Willard Hayek and Gloria Katz. And there was an opportunity to try to get this film financed and in the independent way that George wanted to do it. In 1969, Easy Rider had come out, and that was a huge success, one of the most successful films at the time. And it convinced the studios that maybe there were filmmakers out there who, with a relatively low budget, you could leave alone and they could do something unusual and bring money to everyone involved. And, but when he went to pitch American Graffiti, it didn't go terribly well. No one seemed to understand this unusual script. There was no one lead character. There were four. There was no stars. He was going to do it with all unknown, actors at the time. And on the title page, it was called a musical, but no one sang and danced in the movie. But of course, the vision for the film from the very beginning was not to have a score. It was that the music would be made up of the great rock and roll songs of the era, and that they would form the sort of, the entry point for everyone in terms of what that period of time was like. So, in fact, this was, very hard for people to understand. They also hated the title and thought it was some kind of an American movie about Italian feet. But finally, Universal did agree to pay for the budget as long as Francis Coppola agreed to be the producer, since he had just finished The Godfather and had developed a certain amount of clout and trust within Hollywood. The budget was very low. It was only $770,000, and George did not get final cut, which was, of course, going to become a big problem at the end. But he did get $50,000 to write and direct. And at the time, that was going to get him through for the next year or two. And he also got 40% of the net profits, which, of course, was unusual for a studio system, but that's what they were doing with these independent filmmakers. Of the budget, he had to spend $100,000 on the music itself. So you can imagine it was a difficult and very low budget shoot. He was able to get all the songs he wanted, with the one exception, which I'm sure you might have noticed, which is that there's no Elvis Presley in the movie. Those tracks were all too expensive and just were not possible. So as they went into pre-production for the film, the casting became the most critical aspect, perhaps, of the whole success of the film. George's many great strengths as a director, but working with actors was not necessarily one of them. When he was filming on a set, he was very focused on the camera and the action and the lighting, many other aspects, and didn't spend a lot of time working with actors or have a background in theater or understanding actors. So casting the right people was just incredibly important. And he probably spent weeks and weeks, 12-hour days, working with a fantastic casting director named Fred Roos, who had cast The Godfather and was also a producer for Francis Coppola. And when you think about who he wound up casting, they really became some of the great actors of the time. Of course, Richard Dreyfuss, who had done a few small roles but was not well known at all, wound up playing Kurt. Through this film, he also met one of George's friends named Steven Spielberg, and was cast, of course, in Jaws and Close Encounters. And in fact, when Dreyfuss won his Academy Award for Best Actor for The Goodbye Girl, he was only 30 years old, and at the time was the youngest actor who had ever won an Academy Award. Then Ron Howard, was somewhat known, of course, from Andy Griffith's show, and Ron was one of the few actors who actually was still a teenager, when the movie was shot. He was very concerned, of course, because he heard it was a musical, and he had been in a very famous musical called The Music Man when he was a kid, but he didn't sing or dance, but nevertheless showed up to audition and he wanted to reinvent himself and be discovered as as a mature actor. Of course, soon after this movie, he went on to star in a TV series called Happy Days, and of course, they became a very successful director as well. Paul Lamont, who plays John, was a little older than most of the cast. His character, of course, became very well loved. In fact, the creators of Happy Days, after seeing the movie, were so convinced it was wonderful character that they decided to add a character to Happy Days called the Fonz, and that's how the inspiration of that character happened. Paul, hi. I hope I'm back. I'm so sorry. Of course, this always happens with presentations, doesn't it? We tested, it all worked well, and here I am. I hope you can still see me. Is anybody back? Can someone confirm whether you can see me again? And I will continue. And I'm so sorry for this interruption. So, was talking about the cast, and now we'll quickly get to the film, though I do want to mention, of course, a couple of the other actors. Cindy Williams, of course, who was fantastic. Later went on to play Laverne and Shirley, another famous sitcom. And then, of course, Candy Clark, who played Debbie, was the only actor who actually received an Academy Award. The film was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, but she was the only actor who got a nomination. And she also got a nomination later for a wonderful film called Man Who Fell to Earth, which was starred David Bowie. And then, of course, there was Harrison Ford. Now, Harrison Ford had been an actor. He had worked in a bunch of TV and different things like that. But he had sort of given up acting and was working as a carpenter. And that's where he was discovered by Fred Roos and Lucas during casting sessions. And he almost didn't do the part because it was written for someone with a buzz cut. And he didn't want to cut his hair. He was only getting $450 a week. So he agreed to do it, but only if he could wear a hat during the film. And that is what he did. And of course, later became very famous for wearing another hat in a movie and playing a character George Lucas created. And I think you all know what happened with his career. And then, of course, there was Mackenzie Phillips, who was 12 years old at the time, the daughter of John Phillips from the Mamas and Papas, and she was one of the few actors who was actually playing her age, and managed to shoot all night for the entire shoot. The producer of the film, became her guardian for this purpose, and it's kind of amazing to watch this 12-year-old girl in the performance that she gave. And then, of course, you all know Mackenzie Phillips also became a huge sitcom star in One Day at a Time for many years. And then, of course, another famous sitcom star from later on was in this film, and of course played the girl, the blonde, in The Thunderbird, and that's Suzanne Summers. Not sure if you all recognized her or not, but this was actually a very interesting part for her. And then last, but certainly not least, was Wolfman Jack himself, because Wolfman Jack actually was not broadcasting in 1962. He came on the scene a bit later, but he was a real character, of course, and a well-loved DJ who did broadcast out of Mexico with some incredibly flamethrower, radio station, and was just beloved and really introduced a lot of wonderful rock and roll to a generation. And George had this plan to have him be, in the film, and not just be in the film, but to use his DJ, patter as sort of a Greek chorus, and that this was going to knit together all of these various scenes and all of the jumping around and smoothing out all these transitions. And Wolfman Jack didn't want to do the part because part of his mystique was no one had ever seen him. No one ever knew what he looked like. But he finally agreed to do it because he loved the script, that he loved George. He only got paid $3,000 for the 1 or 2 days of work, but he also did get 1 point or 1% of George's back end on the film, which probably added up to several $1 million over his life. So it obviously worked out incredibly well, and I think was, again, part of the vision Lucas had from the very beginning to use the music as this kind of backbone and really drive the whole film and pull it all together. So filming started in June of 1972. It was going to be shot in San Rafael, which way, Lucas lived nearby in Mill Valley. This is in Northern California. Now George went on to live in San Rafael for most of his life. They were shooting for 2 days, though, and although they had the right permits, the city decided to shut them down. It was much noisier, much more intrusive than they expected. So suddenly, with a 28-day shoot, they had to move the entire production up to a town called Petaluma. Although at the very end, they did come back to San Rafael for a couple of the bigger, car cruising scenes on 4th Street, the main street of San Rafael. This was an incredibly difficult and chaotic shoot. You have to imagine there were only 28 nights of shooting, because the entire film takes place at night, and it was summertime, so there's not a lot of night, black, dark night to shoot it. To try to get through this, Lucas had the plan to shoot everything with 2 cameras, which of course is done all the time now, but was very unusual at the time. And of course there was a lot of use of camera mounts and different, technical ways that Lucas figured out to place the camera to create some interesting angles and interesting style. He wanted to sort of have a documentary style. You don't see a lot of crane shots or long tracking shots, and he also decided to shoot it on Techniscope, which is a film stock that allowed him, first of all, it's a lot less expensive, and secondly, it creates a lot of grain in the image, which was sort of the look that Lucas was trying to achieve with that sort of documentary style. And it was mostly shot with natural light. There was very little lighting. Obviously, bulbs were placed in, in the proper street signs and in the backgrounds and the cars. But if you look at it, it has a, I wouldn't say it, but it was very much the style he was looking for, and the lighting and the quality of the visual images that he was looking for. And directing, of course, is such a difficult and hugely demanding thing to do, and Lucas, for Lucas, the actual shooting of the film is sort of the least interesting part. And as you know, after the first Star Wars, he had other directors come and direct other Star Wars. And he's, was not the healthiest person with diabetes and was often sick or falling asleep. And it was very chaotic, needless to say. But some very good things happened because of that. What happened, of course, there was a lot of improvisation, and there's a very loose feeling to the performances. And it was shot so fast, the actors didn't sometimes even know where was the cameras, and was it a long shot, or was it a close-up, and when George was going to cut, so they would just sort of keep going. And it really created performances that felt very real and alive. And Lucas doesn't talk to the actors that much, so they really had to sort of trust themselves and the characters they were creating, and there was a lot of space for them to improvise and make, and make the feeling of the film very real, and I think that's something that you can all recognize here. A lot of happy accidents. In fact, the opening scene of the movie, when Toad arrives on the Vespa at Mel's Diner and has this kind of accident where he doesn't brake properly, it winds up crashing into the garbage can. That was a complete accident. That was not planned, and the actor just simply pushed on the gas instead of the brake. But of course, it was a very appropriate entrance for Toad, and they kept it. And that would always start the film with a big laugh and put the audience in the right place. Harrison Ford would do quite a bit of improvising with his character. There wasn't a lot of dialogue for him originally, but that all worked out pretty well. Another example of sort of a live, non-planned event was at the Hop. There was the snowball dance when Steve and Laurie kick off the dance. And if you know what a snowball dance is, I hope you're still seeing and hearing me. I'm very sorry if this is not a good connection. I don't know what happened. My internet seems to have a problem. I'm going to try one last thing because I'm getting messages. Okay, this is very frustrating, as I'm sure you all realize. So we'll continue. I do know there are things cutting out, but something seems to have gone wrong with my internet. So I will just try to continue on. To get through the snowball story. So a snowball dance in the early 60s was that two people would start off the dance, but soon afterwards, then they would peel off and choose other partners, and they would dance together, and then they would peel off and choose other partners, and soon the whole, everybody would be dancing, at the party. But Steve and Laurie were so wrapped up in each other and sort of waiting for the direction from the director as to what to do, that they just kept dancing together and talking. And you could actually see in the background the actors all anticipating that someone was going to peel off and ask them to dance, and it never happens. So again, it actually worked, very well for their relationship and for, the film, but it was certainly not what was being planned. As I mentioned, the lighting was very problematic, and you can see there are a few scenes that are quite dark. After the first week of shooting, a very famous cinematographer who was a friend of Lucas's named Haskell Wexler came in, and although not credited as the director of photography, I think he has a visual consultant credit or something. But he managed to bring in the right kind of bulbs to get the street lights and signs working, and added some of the car lighting, and it did kind of create that somewhat oversaturated and sometimes a little garish look, but it seemed to be appropriate to the tone and to match the content. And basically, they were able to get it all, everything that was in the script in the 28 days, except for one kind of important scene. It was actually the opening scene of the film. And the opening scene of the film is of a empty drive-in movie theater. And across the car lot drives the one Thunderbird, the white Thunderbird. And this was, again, the idea, of course, that the Thunderbird, this ghost or angel character, is real or not real, but certainly something very real to Kurt. And it really established somewhat of a magical moment at the very beginning of the film that never actually did get shot. So the film was finished, and then, of course, the post-production begins, and this is where Lucas's genius really comes through in all his films and all his filmmaking. It was a huge challenge. It was shot incredibly fast, 2 cameras, tons and tons of footage, but that's, again, what Lucas did. And of course, he also had the help of, at the very beginning, of a very famous Hollywood editor named Verna Fields, who later went on to do many, many big Hollywood movies. And the other editor was his wife, Marsha Lucas. And Marsha Lucas was an incredible editor in her own right. She edited many of Martin Scorsese films, including Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and also edited Taxi Driver. And in fact, she won an Academy Award as the editor for Star Wars. So the editing went on and on and on, but was in good hands. And then, of course, the sound was such a critical part of this film. And for the sound, he also turned to an old USC student friend named Walter Murch, who many of you may have heard of, probably the greatest sound designer of modern times, also an editor himself. And the whole process about how they could then go through using the music, but not just playing the songs, but constantly changing the perspective of the songs. As you'll notice, sometimes the song is playing as source music, coming from a radio, but then suddenly it'll come quite loud as they open up the scene and jump out of the car, or there's music playing in the background at Mel's Diner. And they would go and re-record this music in post-production, coming out of different kinds of speakers. So they would have different qualities and from different perspectives. And it really is worth listening to again because it was just brilliant. And of course, this soundtrack, this idea of doing a movie with no original written underscore, but just using songs and how the songs were so important is something that became very popular. A lot of other directors do it now, as you know, like Quentin Tarantino, of course, is very, the Coen brothers, lots of directors use songs instead of underscored key moments in their movies. And the sound effects, of course, were equally important, and getting the sound of each car accurate and right, and even adding sound where there was no source for the sound. One example, there are many, but one example is that in the scene where Kurt has to go and do the stunt with the police car and chain it up to get good with the pharaohs, you start to hear a train, this noisy train going by. And there's no train, you never see any train tracks or anything else, but there's this sort of cacophony of sound that starts in the background. And there is no music at that point, that it sort of drops out and adds a sort of little tension to this action scene. And again, it was a brilliant idea, and one that was actually Walter had done it before in Godfather 1, if you remember the famous scene when Michael comes out of the bathroom in the cafe and shoots his archenemies. So very good examples. And then, of course, the other key ingredient was weaving the Greek chorus of Wolfman Jack through the film, and how Wolfman Jack and his comments and some of the the call-ins that go on all kind of kept the backbone of the film together. One of the call-ins actually happens to be George Lucas's voice. But anyhow, the first cut of the film was over 160 minutes, but the contract with Universal required a 110-minute cut. And the film had changed. It was originally going to follow the four stories in a very regular way, A, B, C, D, but a much looser narrative flow had to evolve in order to shorten the film, and perhaps ultimately made the film more interesting. So there's a very infamous first preview screening that occurred for the film. It was in San Francisco at the North Beach Theater with over 800 people attending, and the first time that any of the studio executives had actually seen the movie. They hadn't even been seeing dailies. And the executive at the time was Ned Tannen. And although the audience went crazy right from the first moment with Toad crashing his Vespa, Ned Tannen hated the movie. And in the back of the auditorium, after everyone left, he just ranted and ranted about what a disaster would be, how this will never be released, how can they possibly save this movie. And Francis Coppola was there, of course, as well. And he just stood up and said, you know what, I'll buy the movie from you. And he was going to give him their $750,000 back. I don't know, he probably didn't have the money, but maybe could have borrowed it or found someone to help him do that. Because, of course, he saw how brilliant it was, and he knew that George had done something really spectacular. It sort of course, Ned Tannen did not agree, which Francis would ultimately regret. He probably would have made about $25 million off of this film after all these years. But instead, George agreed, okay, I'll try to make some editing changes. I'm going to make it shorter. Maybe we'll find some ways to make it more accessible. And he tried. He kept going, editing for a couple of months. There were other screenings in Los Angeles and other places. But nothing could convince the Universal executives that this film was going to work. In fact, they actually took the film away from Lucas, which was, an awful, awful blow. They cut 4 minutes out of the film. I don't know exactly what they were, but they did cut those minutes out of the film. And it certainly was the last time Lucas ever agreed to do a film that he did not have final cut. And Universal still did not know what to do. At one point, they were going to release it as a TV movie because they didn't think it was worth marketing or spending anybody on at all. But eventually, they were convinced, well, let's just put it in a couple of movie theaters and see what happens, without any advertising. And word of mouth had gotten out, and it was an immediate success. There were sold-out showings, and Universal realized they did have something good on their hands. They expanded into many theaters and gave it a proper release. It stayed in movie theaters for almost 9 months, and it became the highest-grossing film of the year. And this American Graffiti is one of the most commercially successful films ever made. By 1990, American Graffiti had earned over $200 million, and this was a film made for $775,000. And at this point, I think it's almost over $300 million. It's earned over that time. So it certainly proved to resonate with the audience. The critics loved it, and ultimately, was nominated for a number of Academy Awards. What it meant for Lucas is he suddenly had money. I think he made $3 or $4 million in a fairly short time. He was able to pay back all his loans, including ones to Francis and his father. 28 years old, and he was a millionaire. And that, in those days, that was a lot of money. And what that did for him is it gave him, of course, some freedom and clout regarding his next film. And his next film was some space opera. He was never able to get the rights to Flash Gordon. That was his dream, was to make a new film of Flash Gordon. So he decided he was just going to write his own instead. But no one seemed interested in it. Nobody really believed that those kinds of movies were going to be successful, and the treatment wasn't terribly good. But because he had the independence now to keep going and the clout from his success, he did make a deal with Fox, and they weren't going to pay him much of a fee. He got $150,000 for writing and directing Star Wars. But he was able to negotiate, since he did not insist on a bigger fee, that he was able to keep the sequel rights, which of course turned out to be important, but even more important, he kept all the merchandising rights. And at the time, people didn't think merchandising for films was a big deal. And of course, the merchandising has made more money than the films themselves over the years, and this enabled him to build, the whole industry. At the Academy Awards, American Graffiti was nominated for 5, including Best Picture, including Best Director, Original Screenplay. As I mentioned, Best Supporting Actress Candy Clark did win. The winner of the Academy Awards that year was a film called The Sting, which was more of a classic old Hollywood movie. And the critics fell all over themselves, praising the film. One of the most influential of all teen films, a funny, nostalgic, bittersweet look at a group of recent high school grads. Not only a great film, but a brilliant work of historical fiction. No sociological treatise could duplicate the movie's success in remembering exactly how it was to be alive at that cultural instant. So if you've not seen the film, please watch it, enjoy it. And now we're just going to talk for a few minutes. I guess I could try to ask some questions, but we may be running out of time, and I do need to explain what we hope to do at the Westdale with our film clubs in the future. I will continue to do these Facebook Live once a week at 7 p.m. on Monday nights, if this is interesting, and hopefully I can get the technology to work better. And this will be a chance for me to sort of talk about some of the films that interested me and affected my career as a film producer. But what we would like to do is to try to form now a whole series of film clubs, which can be much more interactive, where everyone can have a chance to talk about what they saw in the film and talk about how they reacted to it and everything else. So what we've done is we put a survey up at our website, thewestdale.ca. And if you can take the time to fill out the survey and give us your email, and the idea is we're going to try to organize the film clubs around genres. So there'll be a film club about documentaries. There'll be a film club about, about other action movies or horror movies or classics or women directors. Actually, we're looking for input. What would be these wonderful genres that you think would be of interest to you? There'll be a moderator for each of these clubs who will help organize that club. And we're going to try to limit it to 10 or 12 people in each club, so there's a chance to interact. We're going to try to make the films, this is all free, of course. There'll be no cost or charge for any of your participation in the clubs. But we will try to make the films also available as inexpensively as possible. And Netflix will be one source, and I know everyone doesn't have Netflix, but it just seems like that would be a good place to choose films from. And we're also going to choose films from a service called Canopy. That's with a K, K-A-N-O-P-Y. And that's a free streaming service. And it's provided by the Hamilton Library, though many other libraries have that as well. And you can simply go to Canopy, the website, and put in your library card number, and you will get access to several hundred films for free. Not modern films, of course. These are mostly classic films, but it's really a great service, and I highly recommend you do it anyhow, just because if we're all looking for new films to see, you'll find many there. And if you don't have a library card, you can actually get your library card online as well at the Hamilton Public Library. So please go and do that. And since it will be a source for free films for these different clubs, and I will be taking some films from that as well. Now, the way we're going to organize the clubs is using a technology called Zoom. And I hope you're familiar with it. If you're not, it may seem complicated, but I don't think it really is. It's a free software, a free app you can download on your computer or on your phone and become a member, or have a login. And it's free. And what it does is it allows you to have these groups of people who, up 10 or 12 is usually a very good number, and you actually appear on a screen with video and audio. So if you're familiar with FaceTime, imagine FaceTime, but with 12 people. It kind of looks like Hollywood Squares, right? And there's some very simple ways in which the moderator will be able to keep this going and, involve the different people, and everyone will have a chance to talk about the film. And it's really something I would recommend you all try. If you don't even have a computer, there will also be a phone number. So you could just call in with your phone. And you see, I just heard a comment that Zoom is only for 40 minutes. It won't be. We will have a professional paid for Zoom account that will allow us to do more people and longer. So that's why we chose this. But again, you can access it even without the software, without Zoom app, because there'll be a phone number, and you can just call in, and then you can, not see everyone, but you'll be able to participate with the audio. So this is going to take a little time to get this all organized, but I really believe this is going to be a great thing. We, of course, don't know what we're doing. We've never done this before. We're going to learn as we go. We love everybody's input and suggestions about how to run this better. Once your club of 12 people is established, we'll probably pick the first film for each club to kick off. But how we pick the films, whether we curate them for you, whether you want to choose your own films, that's going to happen very much at the club level, is what we anticipate. Um, so go to the website. There'll be lots of more information. There's a new email address called filmclub@thewestdale.ca. And if you have questions, please email us. And if you have suggestions, please email us. We are actually looking for someone who might be an IT type person who has a lot of experience with using Zoom, who can help us with some of the technical challenges of getting this all organized. So if you know anybody or if that's something that interests you, please email us and let us know. We want to get started quickly. We just will start because we think people are really looking for an opportunity to do this. And I think we'll see. This could go on for a couple of months. And who knows, maybe even after the Westdale opens, we're going to find out that this is something people like. And we can do this with films that we show at the Westdale. The film I want to talk about next week was a film basically from the same era. It was actually released in 1974, and it's called Chinatown. And for those of you who've seen it and know, it's an extraordinary film noir type detective story. It was written by Robert Towne, won an Academy Award, is considered one of the greatest screenplays. It was directed by Roman Polanski, an absolutely genius director who unfortunately never really had an opportunity to do as many. He had done some great films in Europe. His first film in Hollywood was actually Rosemary's Baby, which was a huge success, of course. Roman was a brilliant director, had a tragedy in his life, as you know, when his 9-month pregnant wife, Sharon Tate, was murdered by the Charles Manson family. Stars Jack Nicholson, probably one of his most iconic roles. Faye Dunaway, who was a huge star at the time. John Huston, and I think if you've not seen it, it stands up pretty well today. So I'll be back here at 7 o'clock on Monday, hopefully with a better internet connection and less interruptions. Please join the Westdale if you'd like to be part of our community and hear more about everything we're going to do. We will be back. We're working hard with everyone else. We're all in this together to survive this time of crisis. We'll try to keep you all up to date with everything we want to do. I'd love to try to answer a few more questions, but I'm finding it kind of challenging at the moment to understand exactly how I'm going to track through and find the right questions. Again, sorry for reading all my notes, but I wanted to try to keep this short and somewhat organized. I did have a question I heard about where did the name American Graffiti actually come from? And I believe that the story behind the name and the title itself, if you want to just give me 1 second, it came from this idea that what the film was in a sense, it was of course American, and it was graffiti. It was iconic images of a time and place, and although that ultimately is a word and expression people may not have understood, they think of it more as just street art. Graffiti could represent and does represent that type of artistic approach. So yes, I'm using a laptop. I'll try not to do that because the fan of my laptop is making noise. Anyhow, I hope you all had a good time. We've kept it to an hour, which was my goal, and this is the start. Hopefully, great things will happen. So, thank you all. If you want to email questions about the film or anything that I talked about, I'll probably be able to find a way to answer them, and maybe we can post them on the site at the Westdale or something like that. So, thank you all. Take care. Stay safe.